Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that unfolds in the radiant palace of Helios and the scorching heat of the heavens, where a young man's pride leads him to seize the reins of the sun chariot and challenge the limits of mortality. It is a tale of a son's quest for identity that sets the world ablaze, turning fertile lands into deserts and leaving a father to mourn the light of his life. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please keep this in mind before watching. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Phaethon driving the sun chariot, the celestial traces of pride and sorrow, begins now. Chapter 1. Seeds of Doubt and a Mother's Secret. In the dusty, sun-washed lands of ancient times, along the endless frontier where Ethiopia and Egypt met, a young man lived whose name matched his nature. Phaethon, whose name meant shining or radiant, stood out among his peers for both his beauty and his uncontrollable pride. He felt that more than the blood of an ordinary mortal flowed through his veins, and his soul constantly reached toward the heavens and the light. Yet that inner restlessness whispered without pause that he did not fully belong to the mortal world around him. Phaethon's greatest rival was Epiphos, the proud prince of Egypt. Epiphos, who claimed that Zeus was his father, could no longer tolerate Phaethon's constant boasting that the Sun God Helios had sired him. One day, in a public square where other youths had gathered, Epiphos's anger and pride finally erupted. As Phaethon spoke of his father's splendor and his dominion over the sky, Epiphos cut him off with a cold, cutting laugh. "You were a complete fool," Epiphos said, locking his mocking gaze onto Phaethon's eyes. "You believed every tale your mother invented. That so-called divine birth was nothing but a grand lie." His cruel words rolled through the square, carried by the laughter of the other youths. Their voices, sharpened by ridicule, tore into Phaethon's claim of divine origin and cut deeply into his pride. In that moment, no matter how fiercely anger burned inside him, shame overwhelmed him. He had no proof in his hands, no undeniable sign to defend himself against the attack. When Phaethon left the square, his face burned with humiliation. As he walked away, the seeds of doubt in his heart quickly took root and spread. If he truly was the son of a god, why did he endure such disgrace? Tormented by these questions, he went to his mother, Clymene. She was known not only for her beauty, but also for her noble lineage as an Oceanid, a sea nymph and daughter of the sea deities Oceanus and Tethys. At that hour, she stood in her home with her usual grace, though sorrow lingered quietly in her expression. Phaethon wrapped his arms around his mother and recounted one by one the humiliation he suffered and the poisonous words Epiphos hurled at him. "Mother, if I truly came from a heavenly origin, give me clear proof," he pleaded. He needed more than reassurance. He needed a sign the entire world could witness. He wanted to know that Merops was not his father, but that Saul, Helios himself, who illuminated the world each day, truly sired him. He begged his mother to release him from uncertainty and restore the honor he believed was rightfully his. Clymene trembled at her son's sorrowful and sincere plea. Whether the insult to her own honor wounded her most, or the pure anguish she saw in her son's eyes pierced her heart more deeply, she lifted her hands toward the sky, toward the sun, who saw and heard all things. In that instant, she embodied both a mother's compassion and a goddess's dignity. As the chamber filled with the blazing light of the midday sun outside, she prepared to swear her most sacred oath. "I swore upon this magnificent and radiant light," Clymene cried, her voice rising with solemn force, "that the sun you looked upon now, the one who ruled the entire world, was your true father." If she spoke falsely, she declared that the light touching her eyes should be the last she ever saw, and that Helios should withhold his brilliance from her forever. The weight of that oath shattered the doubts gripping Phaethon's heart, at least for a time. Yet Clymene did more than swear. She told her son where he could find his father. She explained that the sun's palace stood in the farthest east, where the first light of day touched the earth. "If your heart was ready, go and ask your father yourself," she said. She described a palace beyond the lands of Ethiopia and India, at the boundary where the sky rose upward, and she urged him to undertake the perilous journey. Her words filled Phaethon with new life. Fear loosened its hold. Hesitation faded. He felt as though he stepped into a second birth. With his mother's blessing and direction, Phaethon set out in fierce excitement. He no longer moved like an ordinary mortal. He strode forward as though divine blood guided his steps. The mocking face of Epaphus no longer lingered in his thoughts. Instead, he saw only his father's radiant palace. He hurried across the scorched lands of Ethiopia and through the distant regions of India, racing toward the sacred place where the sun rose each morning. This journey was more than an attempt to defend his honor. It was a march toward destiny. As he traveled, Phaethon remembered the magnificent union Clymene described, and the universal joy that welcomed his birth. The sky echoed with song, and the daughters of Oceanus bathed him in sacred waters. The thought that he was not merely a shining youth, but the true heir of light, transformed the harsh roads into something almost celebratory. A single vision sustained him. One day the world would see him standing in his father's glorious chariot. His burning desire, fused with the reckless courage of youth, blinded him to the danger before him. Each day, Helios steered his chariot across the most perilous paths of the sky to preserve cosmic order, a task that demanded divine strength. Phaethon, however, saw only the need to silence his rival and satisfy his wounded pride. That fierce inner drive carried him onward, all the way toward the ivory and gold palace that gleamed at the world's farthest edge. By then, he had long left the borders of Ethiopia behind. He advanced with unwavering determination toward the brightest stretch of the heavens, toward the place where his father rose each dawn. With his mother's oath burning in his heart, his father's throne fixed in his mind, and that dangerous light blazing within his soul, one of the ancient world's most tragic journeys began. He knew nothing yet of the monstrous constellations that prowled the sky or of Zeus's devastating lightning. He carried only a son's fierce and desperate longing to reach his father. Chapter 2. The light at the edge of the world, the palace of the sun. Guided by his mother Clymene, Phaethon set out on his journey. He left behind the burning lands of Ethiopia and the mysterious plains of India, and at last he reached the farthest eastern edge of the world, the sacred boundary where the first light of day touched the earth. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, his eyes caught a brilliance rising along the horizon, a radiance no ordinary mortal had ever been meant to behold. What stood before him was not merely a dwelling. It was a magnificent palace that gathered within itself the splendor of both heaven and earth, the very residence of the Sun God Helios. The palace of the sun rose upon colossal columns that stretched toward the sky. Gold and fire-colored bronze covered them, and they blazed like giants bearing the vault of heaven upon their shoulders. At the highest points of the palace, triangular pediments shone with pure white light, their ivory carvings glowing with sacred clarity. Every corner of the palace displayed precious stones that reflected the celestial authority of Helios and his singular place in the universe. Yet the true grandeur lay in the massive double doors of silver. Before he stood in the presence of the god he believed to be his father, Phaethon lingered before those doors, captured by the artistry worked into their surface. Hephaestus, also known as Mulciber, the god of fire and iron, had forged the entire universe into those silver wings, sea, land, and sky enclosed within their frame. The craftsmanship was so vivid that the figures seemed ready to stir and breathe at any moment. As a son searching for the truth of his origin, Phaethon gazed at that miniature world in awe, knowing it represented the realm over which his father ruled. At the lowest part of the doors, the endless waters that encircled the earth unfolded in silver relief. The deities of the sea emerged from the metal as if alive. Mighty Aegeon coiled his vast arms around the backs of colossal whales. Proteus shifted endlessly from form to form. Triton lifted a seashell to his lips and commanded the waves. The sea goddess Doris stood among her 50 daughters, the Nereids. Some glided through deep blue waters, while others wrung their green hair dry upon the rocks. Though Hephaestus shaped their faces with striking similarity, each sister carried her own distinct beauty. In the central panels, the pulse of the terrestrial world came into view. Cities thrived beneath human hands. Dense forests sheltered wild beasts. Rivers curved through valleys in winding paths. The nymphs moved among trees and springs. The river gods known as Flumina rose in flowing form. Rural deities guarded quiet lands. Every detail had been carved with deliberate precision, as though the silver surface held a map of every place ever touched by the light of Helios. At the highest point of the doors, the heavens crowned the composition. 12 zodiac symbols stood in ordered symmetry, 6 upon each wing, marking the celestial authority of the palace. They revealed the structure of the cosmos itself. They also served as silent warnings of the perilous path that stretched across the sky, the very path Phaethon longed to claim. Yet as he stood before that masterpiece, ambition and wonder burned too fiercely within him for him to recognize the warning hidden in its design. When Phaethon stepped through the silver doors, the light inside struck him with such force that he feared blindness. As he moved along the corridors, he entered a realm where his father, Helios, also called Phoebus, ruled not only as the source of light but as master of time itself. Time did not drift unseen there. It stood embodied, watchful and silent. Concepts that mortals knew only as passing measures appeared before him in living form, bound in service to his father. Along the path that led to the throne room, Dies, Mensis, Annus and Secula stood at measured intervals. They guarded the rhythm of existence, steady and unyielding. Among them moved the Horae, the hours, swift and precise in their motion. As Phaethon watched each hour move in flawless obedience to his father's will, he began to grasp, for the first time, the immense burden Helios carried. Beyond these guardians, the seasons encircled the throne, each marked by unmistakable presence. Spring, called Ver, radiated youth and renewal, a crown of fresh flowers resting upon her head. Beside her stood Summer, Aestus, crowned with a wreath of harvested grain. Autumn, Autumnus, bore feet stained dark from crushed grapes. Winter, Hemes, stood rigid and pale, frost falling from his hair and beard. Together they formed a sacred cycle, sustained and commanded by the light of Helios. At last Phaethon reached the heart of the palace. Before him rose a throne adorned with gleaming emeralds. Upon it sat Helios, clothed in royal purple, his presence vast and sovereign. Upon his head rested the radiant crown from which blinding rays burst forth. Faced with that overwhelming brilliance, Phaethon could not draw nearer. He remained where he stood, lifting his hands to shield his mortal eyes. In that moment, he felt not only the longing of a son seeking his father, but the frailty of a mortal standing before divinity. Helios, who beheld all things, looked down from his throne and recognized the young stranger at once. He knew Phaethon as his own son. Paternal affection stirred within him, and astonishment blended with deep pleasure at seeing the boy who had come so far. Perceiving his son's fear, Helios removed his radiant crown and softened the blaze of his light. He beckoned him forward. The vast distance between father and son closed, and fate advanced beyond recall. With the light subdued, Phaethon saw his father's face clearly for the first time. Within those features he recognized reflections of himself, traces of the same divine radiance. Helios asked why he had traveled such a distant path to find him. Phaethon remembered the humiliation he had endured and the taunts of Epiphus. He asked for only one thing, a sign so undeniable that it would prove to the entire world that he truly was the son of a god. That request stirred the first winds of a storm that would soon shatter the magnificent peace of the Palace of the Sun. Chapter 3. The Encounter with the Father and the Irreversible Oath. Phaethon longed to tell his father about the ache he had carried for him and the humiliations he had suffered at the hands of Epiphos. Yet the light between them burned so fiercely that he could not see his father's face. Helios, in response, lifted the radiant crown from his head so its brilliance would no longer wound his son. He drew back his blazing rays and allowed Phaethon to come near. In that moment, a god stepped closer to something human. The overwhelming light softened, and warmth gave way to an embrace. Phaethon rushed forward, and Helios gathered him tightly in his arms. That embrace became the living proof of the acceptance and identity the young man had sought all his life. Before the entire palace, Helios declared, "You were truly my son, and your mother Clymene spoke the truth." And with those words he affirmed Phaethon's noble birth. Yet for Phaethon, Knowing he was the son of a god no longer sufficed. He wanted a sign so great that it would silence every voice that had mocked him. One by one, the young man recounted the doubts cast upon his name and the scornful words Epaphras had hurled at him. "Give me a proof so undeniable that no one will ever question that you were my father," he pleaded. Too proud and too ambitious to accept mere words, he demanded a sign that embodied divine power itself. Helios, swelling with fatherly pride, did not sense the terrible mistake that waited within his son's earnest request. Overcome with paternal devotion, Helios swore by the river Styx, the most sacred and dreadful oath among the gods, that he would grant his son's wish. "Ask whatever you desired," Helios said. "Whatever your heart sought, it would be given." The dark waters that bound the gods stood witness to this vow. Once spoken, that oath sealed a fate no god could undo, and from which there was no return. The instant Phaethon heard the promise, he gave voice to the dangerous dream he had nurtured in silence. "I wanted to drive the chariot of the sun for one day." He longed to seize the reins of the sacred path his father traced across the sky each day, to show the world who he was. Yet that wish did not merely reach for glory, it reached toward a disaster that would shake the order of the cosmos. The words struck Helios like a blow. Regret and fear washed over him. The joy faded from his face, replaced by sorrow and dread. He shook his head, struggling to deny what had been asked. "If only I could take back my word," the sun god cried, for in that instant he understood that his son had asked for his own death. But the oath had been sworn upon the Styx, and neither god nor fate could shatter it. Desperate to turn him aside, Helios described the deadly journey that awaited any mortal who dared to cross the sky. "Your youth and your strength were not equal to this task. Your wish reached far beyond mortal limits," he warned. He spoke of the steep climb at dawn, when even the immortal horses strained against the ascent. He told of the blazing noon when the chariot reached the summit of the heavens, and even his own heart trembled at such height. His warnings grew darker. The sky was no empty road. It stretched like a vast labyrinth crowded with monstrous constellations. Phaethon would face the horns of Taurus, the claws of Leo, the venomous tail of Scorpio, and the crushing pincers of Cancer. Only divine skill could guide the chariot through such terrors, and you were mortal, he said, striving to restrain his son's burning ambition. More than that, Helios confessed that even Zeus, king of the gods, would not have dared to hold those reins, and that even the power that hurled lightning would have faltered before the chariot of the sun. If such a burden defied a god, how could a mortal youth command those blazing horses? Yet Phaethon heard not warning, but challenge. In every danger, he imagined the glory of a hero he believed he would become. With a final plea, Helios begged, "Ask for something else. Ask for the wealth of the earth, the pearls of the sea, or the jewels of the heavens. But do not ask for this chariot. It brought not blessing, but ruin." Still, pride chained Phaethon's heart, and the shadow of Epaphras pressed upon his mind. He fell at his father's knees and insisted. He did not understand that one day of shining across the sky might demand an eternity of darkness. Bound by his oath, Helios yielded at last and surrendered his son to fate. As he led Phaethon toward the magnificent chariot of gold and silver forged by Hephaestus, his heart broke within him. That hour became the final moment of peace between father and son. Dawn crept closer, and the sky blushed red, as though it sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Phaethon leapt onto the chariot in exultation, blinded by ambition, unable to see the silent tears that fell from his father's eyes. Chapter 4. The Divine Warning. This was not the work of a mortal. As the irreversible and terrible oath sworn upon the river Styx echoed between the ivory columns of the Sun Palace, indescribable remorse settled into Helios's heart. The compassionate father who had just embraced his son trembled in horror, for he felt as though he had signed his child's death warrant with his own hands. He shook his radiant and majestic head in grief and cried out, "If only I could have taken back that promise, Phaethon." His divine voice left a mournful resonance upon the silver doors of the palace, for he had become the prisoner of a sacred oath that not even a god could break. Phaethon remained far from understanding the sudden change in his father's spirit. In his mind, only the mocking face of his friend Epiphos and the triumphant image of himself holding the reins of the sun chariot existed. Helios tried to break that blind courage with the most sincere and terrifying warnings he could offer. "Your desire exceeded the limits of a mortal," he said. He looked at the young man's fragile shoulders and his still beardless face, and felt pain as he imagined how such a burden would crush him. He tried to make his son see that what he sought was not a reward, but a disaster. The sun god attempted to dissuade him by laying out, in the finest detail, the dangerous path he traveled each day. He described how steep the road grew in the early hours of the morning, and how even the fiery horses panted as they climbed the slope. When he spoke of the moment they reached the highest point of the sky at noon, his voice darkened. "Even my own heart trembled at that height," he confessed, hoping his son would feel the divine fear that gripped him as he looked down upon the endless seas and lands below. Helios reminded him that the sky was no empty void, but a labyrinth filled with dreadful monsters. One by one he named the savage guardians of the zodiac that would rise before Phaethon on that journey. He explained how the chariot would have to swerve away from the sharp horns of Taurus, how it would need to escape the tearing claws of Leo and the crushing grip of Cancer. Each constellation would have stood before him like a living spectre dwelling in the heavens, ready to destroy a mortal driver. His most frightening warning concerned Scorpio. Helios described how vast a space that creature occupied in the sky, how it lifted its tail high and spread its legs wide as it waited. When you saw its body sweating black venom and its stinger poised to strike, your knees would have knocked together, he said. He knew that only a divine will commanded such monsters, and that a young man would have lost his reason in the face of that terror. Yet Phaethon treated his father's words as mere obstacles in a heroic trial. With one final effort, Helios spoke the greatest truth. Even mighty Zeus, ruler of the heavens and wielder of thunderbolts, did not dare to drive this chariot. If the king of the universe could not restrain those fiery horses and their burning path, how could a mortal youth have succeeded? "Did you think you were stronger than Zeus?" he asked. The question should have pierced Phaethon's pride, yet his obsession with proving himself the son of a god drowned out the voice of reason within him. Instead of extinguishing the fire in Phaethon's heart, his father's intense warnings only fed it. He imagined every danger as part of a grand heroic tale. When Helios saw that stubborn expression fixed on his son's face, despair weighed heavily upon him. "Was my fear not enough to show you that I was a true father?" he cried. "Look into my eyes and see the pain in my heart. I refused you out of love, not hatred." No. The sun god offered him all the riches of the earth, the seas, and the sky. He stood ready to lay before him every treasure, the rarest jewels, any kingdom imaginable. "Ask anything of me, so long as you abandon this deadly desire," he pleaded. Yet Phaethon fell at his father's knees and demanded only one thing: the sun chariot. To appear before his friends upon that golden chariot, to silence Epiphos, and to carve his father's legacy into the sky had become his sole purpose. Helios knew that time had grown short and that the decision had to be made before dawn. "While there was still time, listen to my counsel, not to my chariot," he said once more. But Phaethon's resolve felt harder than divine will itself. With heavy steps, the sun god led his son toward the magnificent chariot crafted by Hephaestus. The walk felt like a father leading his own child to an altar of sacrifice. As Phaethon moved forward in joy, Helios's shoulders sank lower than ever. Behind the doors of the Sun Palace, preparations unfolded. The horses neighed, and their fiery breath echoed through the corridors. Helios gave one final instruction. "Do not use the whip. Hold the reins tightly. The horses would run by their own will. Your true task was to keep them on the path." His words sounded fragile against the approaching catastrophe. When Phaethon leapt onto the golden chariot and took the first step toward the great tragedy that awaited, the sky stood in silent ignorance of what was about to come. Chapter 5. Fiery Horses and the Golden Chariot. The sun god Helios, crushed beneath the weight of the terrible and irreversible oath he had sworn upon the river Styx, led young Phaethon toward the magnificent creation forged by the masterful hands of the smith god Hephaestus. Phaethon was so blinded by ambition that he did not notice his father's sorrowful sighs or the immense burden of regret resting upon his shoulders. His entire attention rested on the splendor of the divine craftsmanship that shone before him like a sea of light. This chariot was not merely a vehicle, it was a masterpiece, strong enough to carry the purest light of the universe and refined enough to match the glory of a god. When Hephaestus built this celestial chariot, he displayed a level of skill beyond anything mortals could imagine. The axle was made of pure gold, the pole was gold, and the outer rims of the wheels were covered in the same radiant metal. The spokes were crafted from silver and set in perfect order. They were worked so finely that they cast shifting patterns of light across the sky whenever the chariot moved. In every part of this magnificent structure, Phaethon saw his father's absolute authority over the cosmos and the genius of Hephaestus. Across the harnesses, chrysolites and priceless jewels were arranged to reflect the heavenly splendor of Helios. The stones caught the sun's own light and scattered such brilliance through the palace that it seemed a second sun burned within its walls. As Phaethon gazed at the blinding beauty of the jewels, he imagined himself ruling that magnificence for a single day. In that moment, his father's warnings faded, and the fear of the monsters in the sky dissolved. Only the intoxicating vision of triumph upon a golden throne filled his heart. As time moved forward in divine order, the dawn goddess Aurora, also known as Eos, threw open her crimson doors and rose-filled halls and announced the coming day. One by one, the stars fled across the sky after their leader Lucifer, the morning star, and the retreat ended when Lucifer was the last to disappear. The moon, Luna, also known as Selene, drew her pale light beneath the horizon and yielded her place to her brother's burning reign. While the edge of the world glowed red in celebration, Helios saw that the Horae, the guardians of time, were growing impatient. Sorrow shook Helios as he prepared his son for this final cosmic duty. With hands heavy with fatherly tenderness, he spread a magical salve across Phaethon's youthful face, a face that had not yet shown the first signs of manhood. The sacred ointment formed a shield, guarding him from the scorching touch of the sun and from the flames that burst from the mouths of the horses that pulled the chariot. As Helios applied the salve, he searched his son's eyes for one final sign. Perhaps the weight of that sacred touch might awaken him from his delusion and persuade him to withdraw his demand. When the protection of the salve was complete, Helios lifted the sacred crown of light, the aureole he wore upon his own head, and set it upon Phaethon's brown hair. 7 sharp rays flared from the crown and wrapped the young man's face in divine brilliance, shaping him into his father's image. To any being looking from afar, Phaethon appeared to be the sun god himself. Yet Helios saw the mortal fragility hidden behind that shining mask and released a heavy sigh, powerless to halt the tragedy drawing near. At that moment, the Horae, swiftest among the goddesses of the sky, brought forth 4 legendary horses from the vast stables of Helios. These mighty creatures fed upon ambrosia, the food of the immortals, and their restless hooves struck against the cool air of dawn. Their names were Phaethon, Pyroa, Eos, and Phlegon. Flames streamed from their nostrils, and the heat of their breath already warmed the sky. Their snorts and neighs crashed against the palace's silver gates like rolling thunder. Eosphorus, the morning star, stepped forward and fastened the horses to the yokes, securing the shining harnesses around their blazing necks. The weight of silver and gold ornaments did nothing to calm them. They burned with the urge to surge into the endless roads of the sky. Phaethon did not tremble before this overwhelming power. Instead, he stroked their gleaming manes, unaware that they had not yet sensed the lightness of a foreign hand upon the reins. When Phaethon sprang onto the golden chariot, the jewel-studded floor beneath his feet and the silver reins in his hands filled him with a false sense of divinity. Helios called out his final warnings, his voice rough with grief. He told him never to use the whip and to hold the reins as tightly as possible. The horses would run by their own will. His true duty was only to guide them along the right path. He warned him not to rise too high toward the palaces of heaven, or descend too low and set the earth ablaze, but to follow the middle course. At the edge of the palace, Clymene stood waist-deep in the water and watched her son's magnificent ascent with pride and joy. She believed with all her heart that her son would finally prove to the world who he was. Yet when Tethys drew back the heavy silver bolts of the gates of dawn and released the horses into the vastness of the sky, the storm that would shatter the balance of the universe began. The horses tore through the clouds and left the winds behind, carrying their young and inexperienced driver toward disaster. Phaethon did not see the tears that fell behind him from his father's eyes. He shouted with joy as the wind brushed across the sacred salve upon his face. He was no longer merely the shining one. He believed he was the radiance itself. But the horses instantly felt the difference. The hand on the reins lacked divine weight. The chariot carried a burden far lighter and more unstable than before. That realization stirred the wild nature of Phaethon, Pyrrhoa, Eus, and Phlegon. The chariot drifted from its course like a ship without ballast, tossed helplessly among the waves. When Phaethon looked down at the vast world spread beneath him, sudden terror gripped him. His pride dissolved into confusion and fear. His father's command to follow the middle path vanished from his thoughts as the horses surged forward in reckless speed. The gates of heaven receded behind him, and the world below shrank into a haze. In that dreadful moment, he understood that the reins did not truly belong to him, but to the four blazing horses. That was the turning point when the brightest morning the ancient world had ever seen began its descent into its darkest ruin. Chapter 6. The Opening of the Gates of Dawn, the Great Ascent. As the damp veil of night receded toward the western shores, the Sun Palace, the highest fortress of the sky, witnessed the most tragic mourning of an eternal cycle. The dawn goddess Aurora, with her usual care, flung open the crimson gates and the rose-scented halls, heralding the approaching day to the cosmos. The stars suspended in the heavens, under the command of their leader Lucifer, the morning star, fled one by one, with Lucifer himself being the last to abandon his post. Meanwhile, the all-seeing Sun God Helios watched with deep sorrow as the world was bathed in crimson light and the pale horns of the moon vanished along the horizon. Helios's heart bled for the impending doom of his child, and he ordered the swift horay, the hours, to harness the horses to their reins. Yet Phaethon's pride had not matured enough to perceive this silent wail. The horay, following Helios's command, brought forth the magnificent horses that breathed fire and fed on ambrosia from their golden stables, fastening them to the chariot with silver harnesses. Phaethon's father, in a final effort, anointed his son's face with a magical salve and placed the sacred crown of 7 beams of light upon his young head. Helios spoke, "If you heed my counsel, release the whip and hold the reins tightly. The horses will run at their own pace," giving his son the last of his technical guidance. Yet Phaethon, intoxicated by the false sense of power granted by the silver reins in his hands, could not perceive the profound anguish and heavy sighs etched on his father's face. Unaware that the great ascent he was about to undertake was in fact the beginning of a fall, the young man stood proudly atop the golden chariot. Tethys, Clymene's mother, and Phaethon's grandmother, entirely ignorant of her grandson's fate, drew back the silver bolts of the gates of dawn. With this gesture, the roads of the endless sky lay exposed before the inexperienced and youthful driver. Helios bade his son farewell, saying, "Go and bring light to the world so they may see you safely." And Phaethon thanked his father joyfully for this great gift. Yet this farewell was more a seal upon an irreversible departure. For the moment the goddess Tethys released the horses, the balance of the universe surrendered to the ambition of a mortal. Phaethon, Eus, Pyrrhoas, and Phlegon, the 4 legendary horses, neighed and spat flames from their nostrils as the obstacles before them vanished. With hooves of fire tearing through the clouds, these divine creatures ascended with such speed that even the morning winds lagged behind. Phaethon, rising toward the sky with the immense momentum of the chariot, felt an indescribable joy in his heart. The mockery of Epaphus and the doubts of his companions shrank to mere specks upon the earth. In that moment, he felt as powerful as Zeus himself, convinced that the dangers his father had warned him of were nothing but frightening tales. Holding the reins of the golden chariot, Phaethon glanced down at the earth in a brief, intoxicating triumph. Yet he immediately sensed something unusual in the weight of the chariot. According to the sources, the chariot bounded through the air with an unfamiliar lightness, like a ship without ballast tossed uncontrollably among waves. The horses sensed instantly that the load upon them lacked its usual divine weight, and that the hands holding the reins carried none of that absolute authority. This false lightness initially appeared as ease to Phaethon, but in reality it signaled the horses' return to their wild nature and their first defiance of the driver. Feeling the inexperience of the driver, Ethan and the others abruptly abandoned the safe and familiar path Helios traversed each day, galloping frantically. Phaethon, terrified by the sudden rebellion of the horses, clung to the reins, yet he knew neither the routes nor possessed the strength to control them. His father's warning to follow the middle path slipped from his mind one by one amid the horses' fierce neighing and the violent jolts of the chariot. The young man painfully realized that the divine power he had sought to prove to the world did not belong to him, and that the reins in his hands were nothing more than ornaments. As the horses defied the reins and charged into unknown regions of the sky, Phaethon's joy gave way to an icy fear. The chariot flew so high that the constellations, frozen and harmless until then, awoke under the scorching heat of the sun. When Phaethon saw the endless world below and the monstrous star clusters above, his knees buckled, and even the protective salve on his face could not conceal the pallor caused by his terror. The mortal desire his father had warned him about now carried him into dark and perilous depths that even the gods dared not enter. By the end of the chapter, Phaethon's golden chariot wavered through the sky like an uncontrollable ball of light, while the horses, having entirely forgotten their driver, traced their own fates. Clymene watched her son's radiant ascent from the shore with pride, while Helios buried his head in his hands in the palace, contemplating how the universe would pay the price of this great mistake. The gates of dawn had closed, and Phaethon, caught in the immense fire wrought by his own pride, raced inexorably toward a cosmic disaster from which there would be no return. Chapter 7. Chaos in the Sky and the Terror of the Constellations. When Tethys drew back her silver bolts and the gates of dawn swung wide open, the four legendary horses of the sun, Ethan, Eos, Pyroa, and Phlegon, hurled themselves into the vast emptiness of the endless sky with a thunderous roar. Their hooves tore through the clouds as they surged upward at a speed that left even the morning winds far behind. Yet within the very first moments, the divine creatures sensed with horror that the hands gripping the reins lacked absolute and godlike authority, that the weight within the chariot did not carry its familiar gravity. That unnatural lightness made the golden chariot jolt and lurch unevenly across the heavens, like a ship without ballast thrown helplessly among violent waves. Phaethon felt the false triumph that had first filled him dissolve into growing confusion, for the horses no longer answered his commands and returned to their untamed nature. Sensing the weakness of the inexperienced driver, they suddenly abandoned the safe and familiar path Helios had traveled each day and veered into the unknown. The young man tried to recall his father's warning to follow the middle course, but terror paralyzed him before the unbridled force of the horses. He could neither find the path nor command the fire-breathing creatures. This became the first undeniable sign of the destructive imbalance that arose when a mortal took upon himself a divine duty. From the highest reaches of the sky, Phaethon looked down at the boundless continents spread beneath him. His face turned pale with dread, and his knees trembled with sudden fear. Blinded by the blazing light, he wished he had never touched his father's horses, never learned the truth of his origin. He no longer felt like the son of a god, but like a helpless captain who had abandoned the helm of a storm-tossed ship. The sky stretched endlessly behind him. An even longer journey lay ahead, and he stood suspended between those two abysses, on the edge of madness. As the chariot drifted from its course and plunged into the coldest and most desolate corners of the heavens, the dangerous figures of the zodiac, long dormant, stirred one by one. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, forbidden to sink into the icy northern waters, felt the sun's scorching chariot draw near for the first time and shuddered in terror. They burned beneath the relentless heat and struggled in vain to retreat into the cool depths denied to them. The cosmic turmoil unleashed by Phaethon shook the entire celestial order. The horses, now beyond control, threatened not only the earth, but also the ancient dwellers of the sky. Terror deepened when the chariot reached Serpens, which had lain motionless and harmless in the frozen polar region. The enormous serpent, long numbed by cold, awakened beneath the sun's unrestrained blaze and ignited with unprecedented fury. Its fiery coils twisted across the heavens, and the threat it cast among the constellations drove Phaethon's fear to its height. Even Bootes, known for guiding his slow-moving wagon across the sky, trembled beneath the scorching heat and attempted to flee, despite his usual steady pace. As Phaethon passed among these colossal and savage shapes of the heavens, the horses lost all sense of direction and seemed to set the entire dome of the sky aflame from end to end. In their reckless flight, far from the ordained path, a vast burn scar stretched across the firmament and formed the shining band, later known as the Milky Way. The fixed stars abandoned their stations before the runaway chariot, and the heavens turned into a blazing inferno, collapsing inward upon themselves. At times, the horses climbed toward the highest vaults of heaven. At other times, they plunged sharply toward the earth, driving both realms toward the brink of ruin. The most dreadful sight that confronted the young driver was the massive constellation Scorpio, which spanned 2 full signs of the sky. When Phaethon saw its body gleam with dark venom and its curved, lethal tail poised to strike, his senses failed him. Horror overwhelmed him at the monstrous form rising before his eyes, and he released the reins from his grasp. As the silver straps fell across the horses' backs, Ethan and his companions bolted wildly through uncharted regions of the heavens, bound by no law and no command. Phaethon's fatal error unleashed chaos that shook the very joints of the sky and bent the axis, the pillar of the universe itself. Atlas, kneeling beneath the Libyan heavens with the vault of the sky upon his shoulders, nearly collapsed under the added weight and rising heat. As the horses raged onward in their frenzy, even Luna, also called Selene, watched in astonishment as the horses of her own brother swept beneath her orbit. The heavens burned, the constellations trembled, and Phaethon, trapped within the fiery hell born of his own arrogance, rushed toward the great destruction in which the earth would soon become the next victim. Chapter 8. The earth was burning scorched lands. When the reins of the golden chariot slipped from the trembling hands of young Phaethon, the 4 fiery horses of the sky, Phaethon, Eos, Pyroas and Phlegon were already lost to a fury no power could restrain. Only moments earlier, the unfortunate son of the Sun God Helios had stood proudly upon that jewel-covered platform. Now, he had become a figure of pure terror. Smoke and sparks closed in around him until he could no longer see where he rode. Feeling the mortal lightness of the burden they carried, the horses grew even wilder, and the chariot plunged toward the earth without control, like a ship stripped of ballast and hurled by violent waves. Phaethon tried to recall his father's warning to follow the middle path, but his mind froze as he watched the continents below ignite and crumble into ash one after another. As the son of Climene fell in a sheer descent from the highest vault of the sky, vast destruction unfolded above the continent of Africa. The sun chariot swept so near to the ground that lands once rich with life suddenly became a blazing furnace. Ancient accounts told how Libya, once green and fertile, lost all its waters beneath the sun's merciless heat and was transformed forever into the barren desert known as the Sahara. The Nymphae mourned beside lakes that shrank into dust and springs that vanished into steam, while the scorched soil of Libya came to embody nothing but death and drought. One of the deepest scars of this cosmic disaster appeared upon the bodies of the Ethiopians, the Ethiopes. As the flames of the sun chariot wrapped the earth like glowing embers, the people of Ethiopia endured a heat unlike anything they had ever known. The blaze drove the blood in their veins to the surface, and their skin darkened permanently beneath its force. From above, Phaethon witnessed this tragic change, and for the first time clearly saw the ruin his pride had brought upon innocent lives. Yet, the horses raged on, deaf to his cries of regret. The Nile, the mightiest river on earth, recoiled before the advancing fire. Fearing that its waters would vanish and its bed would lie exposed and empty, the river god fled to the farthest edge of the world and buried his head beneath deep sand. From that day forward, people said that this flight explained why the source of the Nile remained unknown. Its 7 mouths filled with dust instead of fertile water, and the 7 broad channels where ships once sailed hardened into cracked and lifeless clay. Phaethon's reckless course crowned not only the rivers, but the highest mountains with rings of flame. Mount Athos, Mount Oeta, and Mount Tmolus blazed like dry wood, along with the forests that covered them. The Rhodope Mountains, once heavy with snow, stood stripped and bare beneath the heat. The springs of Mount Ida dried away, and the hills of Helicon and Haemus melted into fire. Mount Etna roared as the volcanic fire within it joined the divine blaze descending from above, while the twin peaks of Mount Parnassus vanished into smoke. The Caucasus, the Alps, and the cloud-wrapped Apennines all burned beneath the same relentless sky. As the entire earth heated like an oven, the chariot beneath Phaethon glowed with a white and blinding light. The golden and silver fittings at his feet scorched everything they touched. The air he drew into his lungs no longer refreshed him. It seared like the breath of a furnace. Within the choking darkness of smoke, he was dragged helplessly onward, unable to tell where he was headed. Cities fell with their walls, and mighty kingdoms with all their peoples collapsed into drifting ash. The river's suffering did not end with the Nile. Sacred waters across the world boiled away. The holy Ganges of India, the Danube, and the Euphrates shrank beneath the flames. Gold within the sands of the Tagus melted and ran through the riverbed like liquid metal. Swans that once sang along the banks of the Cayster gathered in the center of the water and fainted from the heat, while the shores of the Alpheus and the Spercheius blackened as though charred by coal. Even the cool streams of the Rhine and the Po fell victim to the raging fire. This vast destruction drove light into the deepest caverns of the earth. Hades, king of the underworld, and Persephone, his queen, trembled at the sudden brightness that pierced the cracking soil above them. The darkness of the realm of the dead shuddered beneath that uncontrolled glare, born of Phaethon's folly. The seas withdrew so far that mountain peaks once hidden beneath the waves rose as new islands. The Cyclades multiplied, and the ocean floor stretched outward like an endless desert of sand. Nereus and Doris, together with their daughters, the Nereids, felt the burning force of the fire even within their cool sea caves. The sea god Neptunus Poseidon lifted his face and arms above the water to search for the source of the chaos. Yet the scorching air that poured from the sky drove him back again and again. Fish plunged to the depths, dolphins failed to leap, and lifeless seals drifted upon the surface. Through Phaethon's fatal error, sky, earth, and sea alike stood on the edge of ruin. Gaia, the nurturing goddess of the earth, also called Tellus, forced herself upright as heat and smoke closed around her. Shielding her face with her hand, she raised a hoarse cry from her parched throat to Zeus, king of the gods. "If this was your will," she said, "then strike me down with your own lightning, but do not let this foreign fire suffocate me." By then, Phaethon had sunk so deeply into unconsciousness that he heard nothing. Upon the golden chariot he swayed like a tragic shadow in the wind, his hair blazing around him. The central pillar of the universe trembled, and chaos lingered at the threshold, waiting to return. Chapter 9. Evaporating Rivers and Melting Mountains. As Phaethon hurtled in terror through his father Helios's golden chariot, the chaos in the sky spread into the deepest veins of the earth. The young man, his hair consumed by flames, remained at the mercy of the 4 fiery horses he could not control, Aethon, Pyrrha, Eus, and Phlegon. He lost the path and no longer commanded the divine reins. When the sun's sacred and scorching heat sealed the earth like the lid of a colossal furnace, the most majestic peaks of the world rose one by one as blazing torches. Phaethon felt the chariot beneath him cease to be a vehicle of gold and become a mass of metal heated so fiercely that it radiated white light. Everything under his feet melted. The majestic Alps, crowned until that moment with eternal snow, and the Caucasus, standing shoulder to shoulder with the clouds, stood defenseless before the sun's merciless nearness and burned like dry kindling. Even the ice of Scythia, once famed for its bitter cold, dissolved and vanished before the divine fire. The mountains of Pindus and Ossa collapsed into heaps of ash within the flames. When the fiery catastrophe sweeping down from the sky struck mighty Mount Etna, which already concealed its own fire in its depths, the volcano roared and hurled out twice the flames, as though it devoured itself. Wrapped in the pitch-black smoke of the artificial midnight he created, Phaethon no longer saw where he drifted. Mount Athos, Mount Oeta, and the twin peaks of Parnassus faded into the choking haze. Mount Ida, once renowned for its springs, lay dry, and the Rhodope Mountains shed their eternal snows and stood bare. The heat did more than melt mountains. It drained the rivers, the lifeblood of humanity and nature, and flung jet-black smoke into the sky. The sacred waters of India's Ganges boiled in their own channel, and towering clouds of steam rising from its banks dimmed even the sun's light. From above, Phaethon watched the apocalypse unfold and remembered with painful clarity his father Helios's warnings and the command to follow the middle path. Turning back no longer remained possible. The majestic Danube, known in antiquity as the Hister, which cut through the heart of Europe, and the Po called Padus or Eridanus in ancient tales, faltered beneath the sun's destructive force. The Po, destined in prophecy to receive Phaethon's tragic fall, shrank into a smoking bed that exhaled the fumes of arrogance. The Nile recoiled in terror, burying its head beneath the sands at the world's farthest edge and withdrawing from its source. River gods scorched one by one in the depths where they sought refuge. The blazing heat melted even the gold hidden in the sands of the Tagus, and it streamed through the riverbed as liquid metal. Along the banks of the Caister, the swans that once sang gathered in midstream and collapsed from the suffocating heat. In Phaethon's hands, the reins lost all strength. As he inhaled scorching vapors that tore through his lungs like furnace blasts, he saw the greatest kingdoms of the world crumble into handfuls of ash along with their fortified walls. Before the spreading inferno, even the vast oceans shrank with each passing moment and withdrew, leaving behind endless deserts of sand. The seas narrowed so drastically that mountain peaks and rocks long hidden beneath the waters rose into daylight as newborn islands. The number of the Cyclades grew, and the cool breath of the water surrendered to burning dryness. Hades, known to the Romans as Pluto and his queen Persephone, trembled at the unnatural light and heat that seeped through the cracking earth. Neptune, called Poseidon by the Greeks, ruler of the seas, refused to remain silent as his kingdom burned. 3 times he rose above the waves, lifting his arm and furious face. Each time the scorching air and the devouring flames drove him back into the depths. The Nereids, daughters of Doris and the ancient Nereus, felt the fire's sting even within their deepest caverns and clung to one another in fear. Within the golden chariot, Phaethon lost control not only of the reins, but of his own destiny. He became a tragic shadow, flung by the wind, his hair blazing. Despite the masterful silver craft of Hephaestus, the spokes of the wheels splintered beneath his feet. The chariot swerved from its course and raced wildly among the stars. Mountains melted, rivers vanished into vapor, seas retreated. The reckless ambition within Phaethon pushed the entire universe to the brink of destruction. Gaia, known to the Romans as Tellus and revered as Earth, the nurturing goddess of the world, struggled for breath beneath the crushing heat and suffocating smoke. With one final surge of strength, she lifted her head and prepared to plead with Zeus, king of the gods. And Phaethon, swallowed by smoke and fire, watched helplessly as the world turned to ash, moments away from the thunderbolt that awaited him. Sky, land, and sea fused into one consuming blaze, and the brightest day of the ancient world advanced toward its darkest ruin. Chapter 10. Gaia's Lament and Zeus's Decision. Phaethon's uncontrolled flight across the sky had turned the earth into a massive furnace, engulfing every corner in flames. Mother Earth Gaia, Tellus, had grown vulnerable as the seas receded, struggling for life among the dried-up streams. Smoke burned her lungs, and with the immense tremor shaking the land, Gaia had sunk deeper than usual, her form quivering. Shielding her face with her hands from the relentless heat of the sun, Mother Earth called out to Zeus, Jupiter, the king of the gods, with a hoarse wail rising from her parched throat. Gaia's lament had been the greatest proof that the universe teetered on the brink of irreversible chaos. "O mighty Zeus, if this is your will, why did your thunderbolts remain silent?" Gaia cried. She suggested that if the world were to be destroyed by fire, it would be a lighter punishment for Zeus's own thunderbolts to bring it about, rather than for it to result from Phaethon's incompetence. Showing her singed hair, the scorching ashes clinging to her eyes, and her smoke-shadowed face, she sought divine intervention through Zeus's mercy. Mother Earth reminded Zeus of the fruits she had offered humanity for millennia, the pastures she had provided to flocks, and the sacred incense she had presented to the gods. "Is this the price of my loyalty?" she asked. She also noted that Atlas, son of Iapetus, who bore the celestial dome upon his shoulders, could no longer endure the burden. Atlas's knees trembled, and under the weight of the sky scorched by Phaethon's fire, his bones creaked. Gaia warned Zeus that if the smoke-drenched poles, which Phaethon's fire had reached, were to melt, even the high celestial palaces of the gods on Olympus would be destroyed. "Look, everything is smoking. If the seas and lands vanish, all will return to that ancient chaos," she shouted. She pleaded one last time for Zeus to uphold his cosmic duty before retreating into the silent underground caverns alongside the shades of the dead, manes, engulfed in smoke. From the highest peak of Olympus, Zeus, Jupiter, heard the heart-wrenching cry rising from the earth and realized that the end of the universe had come. He immediately summoned all the gods, especially Helios, Sol, the father who watched in horror at the destruction caused by his child, to witness the unfolding events. He showed them that without immediate intervention, not only the earth but the entire sky would turn to ashes. Zeus ascended to his high citadel, where he usually shrouded the world in clouds, but no cloud remained to cast a shadow or drop a single raindrop to extinguish the fire. Phaethon's heat had evaporated everything. Seeing that absolute destruction had become the only solution, Zeus grasped the immense thunderbolt he always kept ready in his right hand, the same weapon that had subdued giants and titans. His target was the young Phaethon, whose hair blazed like a torch and who was helplessly tossed upon the horses, Ethan, Pyroa, Eos, and Phlegon. When Zeus hurled the thunderbolt with all his might, the roar echoed through every corner of the universe. The bolt struck not only Phaethon, but also extinguished the fire with fire, tearing the Sun Chariot into pieces. With the thunderbolt's impact, the Sun Chariot exploded violently in the sky. The golden axles, silver wires, and jewel-encrusted wheels, crafted by Hephaestus, Vulcan, scattered across the void of the universe, forming a massive wreckage. Helios's fiery horses, which no one had ever controlled until that day, broke free from their silver reins and bolted into the dark emptiness in terror. Phaethon, his life's light extinguished, detached from the remains of the chariot and plummeted downward. Still ablaze, Phaethon descended through the sky like a star streaking across a cloudless night, leaving a shining trail behind him, a star that had never truly fallen. This radiant youth paid the price for his pride and his desire to prove himself to his father, Helios, Sol, when he fell into the waters of the Eridanos, Po River, far from home. The river embraced his half-burned, smoke-covered body and finally quenched Phaethon's burning fire. Although Zeus's decisive intervention had begun to calm the fires on Earth, the marks left behind were indelible. The world, spared from total annihilation by Gaia's anguished cries, could never return to what it had been. Phaethon's fall etched itself eternally into the memory of both gods and humans, a lasting testament to the destruction that unchecked ambition and excess could bring. As fragments of the chariot scattered through the sky, Helios buried his face in his hands in mourning, while the universe braced itself to pay the price for this tragic day. Chapter 11. The Torch Fallen from the Sky, Phaethon's Tragic End. When Zeus, the absolute ruler of the heavens, heard the cries of Mother Earth Gaia rising through the smoke, he finally acknowledged that the universe teetered on the brink of irreversible destruction. From his highest palace, the god watched this catastrophe that shook the cosmos with horror, realizing that not a single cloud remained to cool the earth, nor a single raindrop to quench the flames. Phaethon's relentless heat had evaporated every trace of moisture in the sky. Understanding that even the palaces of the gods would turn to ashes if no intervention came, the mighty god gripped with great fury the destructive thunderbolt he always kept ready in his right hand. This final intervention aimed to extinguish fire with fire and to reunite the universe's fractured joints. With all his strength, Zeus hurled the thunderbolt at the young Phaethon, who had lost control atop his golden chariot. The colossal strike, exploding in the sky, threw the driver from his seat and shattered the radiant sun chariot into pieces. Golden rims, silver reins, and jewel-encrusted axles, crafted by Hephaestus's skilled hands, burst into fragments, scattering into the endless void, leaving behind only a scorched heap of metal from the once magnificent structure that carried the light of the universe. The four fiery horses of the sun, Phaethon, Pyroa, Eos, and Phlegon, panicked at the thunderbolt's strike, breaking free from their yoke and scattering into the dark corridors of the sky. Phaethon, whose life ended instantly, was launched like a missile from the center of this ruin. The unfortunate youth, his hair still ablaze like a torch, descended from the highest peak of the heavens, gliding across the cloudless night like a shooting star. Tracing a luminous arc as he fell to earth, this shadow paid the price of a mortal touching divine fire with a smoky farewell. Phaethon's burning body plunged with tremendous noise into the cool waters of the majestic Eridanos, Po River, far from his home and the arms of his mother Clymen. The river god embraced the smoke-rising tragic body with a motherly tenderness, accepting it into his depths. The agonized, deafening crackle that arose when molten metal and burned flesh met the water was the last sound heard through the reeds along the riverbank. When the waters closed over him, only a sorrowful handful of steam rose to the sky, remnants of the ambitious and prideful fire that had scorched the world. The naiads of the west, water nymphs, carefully carried this tragic wreck from the river's depths to the shore. Phaethon's face, once rivaling the sun in brilliance, had now grown pale and peaceful. His ambition had been replaced by final tranquility. They laid him to rest on the calmest shaded bank of the river and inscribed upon his tomb eternal lines, that would forever remind mortals of both their pride and a child's courage. Here lies Phaethon. He dared to drive his father's chariot. Though he failed to control it, he fell with immense courage. With Phaethon's descent into the darkness of the waters like a shooting star, the great chaos that had shaken the universe gave way to mournful and ancient silence. Though his pride had turned the world to a desert, his tragic end awakened even the gods' mercy. Phaethon had become a spent spark in the river's dark depths, and an eternal symbol whose memory would transform into drops of amber. Chapter 12. Transformations on the River Metamorphosis. After Phaethon had plunged into the cool waters of the Eridanos, Po River, streaking like a star from the sky by the thunderbolt that Zeus, Jupiter, had hurled, the earth and the heavens had fallen into a deep, mournful silence. The Hesperian naiads, water nymphs, had buried the young man's smoke-streaked body in the riverbank soil and had engraved a tragic inscription upon it. Yet Phaethon's loss had been far too great to end with a mere tombstone. The grief that followed him had been destined to provoke metamorphoses profound enough to change the very face of nature itself. Phaethon's sisters, the Heliades, Merope, Helle, Aigle, Lampetia, Phoebe, Aetheri, and Dioxippe, had run to the banks of the Eridanos in a frenzy of sorrow when they had received the tragic news of their brother. The young women, racked by the guilt of having yoked the horses to the chariot without their father Helios, the sun, consent, had knelt and wept at the grave for days. As their unending cries had echoed through the river waters, a divine power had moved to eternalize this pure grief. The daughters of the sun had felt themselves bind ever more tightly to the earth beneath their feet as they mourned. Fine roots had begun to extend from their toes into the river's depths. A hard bark had slowly encased their legs, rising to cover their trunks and chests, rendering them immobile. Their arms, once stretched to touch their brother, had transformed into leafy branches, while their tawny hair had turned one by one into shimmering poplar leaves, fluttering in the wind. As the transformation neared completion, their mother Clymene had discovered them and had frantically clawed at the tree's bark to rescue them, yet from every wound had flowed fresh sap instead of blood. The Heliades had cried out with one last voice, "Please, mother, do not harm these trees that are our bodies. We are taking our leave." And the bark had finally sealed their lips completely. The sorrowful poplars that now adorned the banks of the Eridanos had begun to utter a rustling lament for their brother Phaethon whenever the wind had blown. The grief of the sisters, now transformed into poplars, had not ceased. The tears that fell from their eyes were no longer drops of water, but golden droplets that hardened instantly under the sun's rays. These shining tears had solidified under the light of their father Helios, known as the Elector, the Shining, into priceless amber, electrum. The amber droplets had dripped from the branches of the trees into the gleaming waters of the Eridanos, carried by the current to distant shores as precious jewels for mortal. Another witness to this tragedy had been Phaethon's closest friend, Cycnus, Kyknos, king of Liguria. Having seen his friend fall in flames, and having mourned by the Eridanos for days, Cycnus's grief had long exceeded the limits of mortal endurance. As he had searched for the ashes of his friend along the riverbank, he had wept with such bitter sound that his voice had resembled a delicate melodic moan rather than a human cry. The gods, moved by sickness's loyal grief, had decided to change his form. Yet this transformation had been less a consolation than a symbol of escape. As sickness's voice had grown thin and faint, his arms had been replaced by snow-white wings, and his neck had stretched gracefully to gaze upon the river's depths. In a short time, the king's entire body had been covered with feathers whiter than snow, and sickness had been transformed by his sorrow into a swan. Fearing the fiery sun that had claimed his friend and Zeus's thunderbolts, sickness had sworn never again to soar into the high heavens. Preferring the safety of the cool waters that had swallowed his companion, he had spent his life gliding silently across rivers and lakes. Once a king, Cycnus had become a symbol of mourning, devoted only to water and shadow, forever avoiding the sun's scorching heat. The banks of the Eridanos had come to host one of the world's most sorrowful and beautiful landscapes through these metamorphoses. Amber tears dripping from the poplars, the Heliades, had gilded the riverbed, while the swan, Cycnus, gliding over the water, had continued to sing the sweetest yet most mournful songs, swan song for Phaethon. These transformations had stood as the greatest testament to how nature could turn the devastation wrought by mortal ambition into art and an enduring legacy. Chapter 13. The Morning Sun and the Celestial Legacy. As Phaethon's smoking body sank into the depths of the Eridanos River, the heaviest mourning in the cosmos began among the high constellations of the sky. The Sun God Helios, known to all as Sol, the all-seeing illuminator, was devastated by the agony of witnessing his child vanish from the heavens in a single bolt of lightning. The Lord of Light, who had until that moment blessed the world with his radiant face, shrouded himself in profound grief and threw aside the radiant crown that crowned his head. As sources recounted, Helios was so overwhelmed with sorrow that day that he began to despise both his own existence and the light he commanded. Fueled by the rage and pain of losing his son, the sun god refused to carry out the duty he had upheld since time immemorial. "Enough!" the grieving father cried. "All this endless labor that has been mine since time began, this dishonorable servitude, must end." Helios locked himself away from the world in a dark chamber for an entire day. That day entered the records of the ancient world as the Sunless Day. The earth was cloaked in pitch-black darkness, and only the final remnants of the fires caused by Phaethon cast a faint glow upon the world. Gods and mortals alike were struck with immense dread at Helios's silent protest. The absence of light signified the end of life itself. Thus all the gods encircled the grieving father, begging him to return to the heavens. Even Zeus, the king of gods, tried to persuade Helios, reminding him of both the threats to his rule and the balance of the universe. Helios responded in anger, "If this chariot is so easy to manage, why does Zeus not take the reins himself?" For he had yet to reconcile with the fact that Zeus had killed his son with a lightning bolt. Ultimately, Helios agreed to resume his duty to prevent the destruction of the cosmos, but his return was not fueled by compassion. It was driven by a thirst for vengeance. The sun god led the still-shaking fiery horses, Phaethon, Pyrrha, Eos, and Phlegon, out of the stables and forced them into the yoke with brutal intensity. As he whipped them onward, he cursed them for failing to protect their master, the young Phaethon, on that fateful day. When the horses felt once more the absolute authority of their true owner, they ascended the steep heavens again, never to stray from their path. Though Zeus had struck Phaethon to preserve order, he felt a measure of mercy for the young man's immense courage and for the ceaseless grief of his father. To immortalize Phaethon's name and story, he raised the boy's spirit among the stars. True to his name, meaning shining, Phaethon took his place in the sky as the constellation Auriga, the charioteer. There he now glimmered in the night sky, a silhouette holding imaginary reins, eternally part of the divine heights he had once sought to reach. Phaethon's fall etched an indelible lesson into the memory of the ancient world. It served as eternal proof of the destruction wrought by unchecked ambition and unrestrained power. As Ovid had written, Phaethon had made a grave mistake, but he had done so with great courage. His story continued to remind all at each dawn of the untamable passions of youth, the weakness of a father who could not harm his child, and the supremacy of cosmic order over individual desire. The earth slowly recovered under the cooling rain sent by Zeus after Gaia's anguished cries. Rivers returned to their beds, forests rose from ashes, yet some traces never vanished. The yellow sands of Libya, the hidden sources of the Nile, and the burned skin of Ethiopians remained as enduring marks of Phaethon's brief reign on earth. Helios, as he illuminated the world each day, remembered his child's pain at the peak of noon, and so the scorching heat of the midday sun was recognized as the unending fire of a grieving father. By the end of the story, order had returned, and the sun chariot resumed its proper path. Yet the cheerful youth who once raced through the palace halls after his father was gone. Phaethon's fiery silhouette drifting from the heavens now lived only in the verses of poets and in the glimmer of shooting stars. This eternal tragedy, flowing forever through the amber waters of the Eridanos River, whispered that even the gods bowed to fate, and that love could sometimes be more perilous than the harshest punishment. Epilogue. The ashes of light and eternal silence. When the wreckage of the golden chariot, shattered by the thunderbolt Zeus hurled, scattered across the sky, the unfortunate young Phaethon, known by the epithet Shining, fell like a meteor into the deep waters of the river Eridanos, his body wrapped in flames. In that terrifying instant, when the universe stood on the edge of absolute annihilation and was pulled back, the cosmos sank into a silence heavier and darker than any it had ever known. The four fiery horses of the sky, Phaethon, Pyrrhoa, Eos, and Phlegon, tore free from their yokes and vanished into the void, while smoke rising from the scorched earth drew a pitch-black shroud of mourning across the blue vault of heaven. The Sun God Helios, known as Sul, watched from the highest peak as his son descended from the sky into oblivion. Beneath the crushing weight of his grief, he came to despise the very light he had once radiated. In deep mourning, he hid his radiant face, cast aside the seven-rayed crown that had illuminated the world until that day, and refused to carry out his sacred duty. The sources recorded that the grieving father left the world in total darkness for a full day. Only the last embers of the fires Phaethon had unleashed and the fading glow of Zeus's thunderbolts that had not yet cooled offered any light to the earth. Although Zeus, king of the gods, had intervened with harsh necessity to restore order, terror seized every inhabitant of Olympus at the sight of Helios's mourning fury. While the other gods pleaded with the Lord of Light not to condemn the world to darkness, Helios cried out with nothing but the helpless anguish of a father who had lost his son. He reproached Zeus himself and declared, "Go and drive those fiery horses yourself, and learn what it meant to tear a child from his father." Yet in the end, to keep the universe from perishing, he reluctantly took up the reins once more. Phaethon's mother, Clymene, crossed the scorched and unrecognizable lands of the earth on a wretched journey to seek her son's ashes and memory. The hopeful mother who once sent her child to the sky to meet his father now searched through burned forests and dried riverbeds for his remains. When she reached the banks of the river Eridanos, known as the Po, she found her son's grave. She pressed her chest against the marble bearing his carved name and soaked it with her tears. In that moment, a mother's grief burned more fiercely than every fire upon the earth. Phaethon's sisters, the Heliades, kept vigil at their brother's grave, their endless cries stirring the compassion of the gods. Known by names such as Merope, Aegle, and Lampetia, the seven sisters trembled so deeply with sorrow that their bodies began to root into the soil beside the river. Their feet fixed themselves in the ground, their arms stretched into branches, and their wind-tossed hair shimmered into poplar leaves. Through that eternal transformation, the Heliades became sorrowful poplar trees, destined to weep for their brother forever. The most poignant detail of that metamorphosis lay in their tears. No longer drops of water, they hardened into golden amber, known as electrum. Baked by the heat of the sun, those precious drops fell into the waters of the Eridanos and drifted with the current to distant shores, where they reached humankind as jewels carrying Phaethon's tragic story. Amber remained upon the earth as the lasting symbol of the endless grief of the daughters of Helios, who bore the name Elector, meaning shining. Another silent witness to the tragedy stood at the river's edge. Cycnus, also known as Caicnos, the loyal friend of Phaethon and king of Liguria. After he saw his companion fall from the sky like a burning star, he wept beside the river with such pure and aching sorrow that the gods chose to reshape his grief into the innocence of a bird. His voice thinned, his body grew feathers white as snow, and Cycnus became a swan. Yet he feared the sun and the sky that had destroyed his friend, and from that time forward he chose to dwell only upon cool waters. Although fresh rains Zeus sent allowed the earth to rise from its ashes, the marks of Phaethon's brief reign remained etched upon every corner of the world like indelible seals. The fertile lands of Libya dried and stretched into what became the Sahara Desert. The Nile hid its head in terror, and its source remained concealed for centuries. The skin of the Ethiopians darkened beneath the scorching nearness of the sun, and that change entered memory as the most visible proof in the mortal world of Phaethon's desperate wish to prove himself to his father. While Phaethon's body dissolved in the waters of the Eridanos, Zeus placed his soul in one of the brightest reaches of the sky. To honor the young man's memory and ensure that the price of his hubris paid with his life would never be forgotten, the king of the gods inscribed him upon the vault of heaven as the constellation Auriga, the charioteer. Thereafter, Phaethon shone each night, imaginary reins held in his hands, this time with a calm and steady light, standing as the silent guardian of the divine height he once sought to claim with his father's chariot. Though Helios returned to his sacred path after his son's death, A sharp pang pierced his heart at every dawn, and most of all at noon, when the sun reached its highest point. Ancient belief held that the fierce heat scorching the world at midday reflected the father's unending grief for his lost child. Day after day, as the Lord of Light traced the same course across the sky, he gripped his horses more tightly and let out a silent sigh whenever he passed the place where he once lost control on that fateful day. Phaethon's story marked more than the fall of a young man. It stood as an eternal allegory of how destructive unchecked ambition, an ignorant craving for divine power, and courage severed from wisdom could become. As Ovid stated, although Phaethon committed a grave error, he fell with great daring, magnis tamen excidit ausis. His descent declared to the cosmos that universal order outweighed individual passion, and that within every brilliance lay the danger of burning. The waters of the river Eridanos still carried the smouldering memory of Phaethon, and the poplars along its banks continued to release amber tears with every passing wind. The shining youth endured as the brightest mark in the heavens and the saddest memory upon the earth, existing along that fragile boundary between light and shadow. Although the universe regained its balance, the legend rising from Phaethon's ashes retold the immortal dance of ambition and grief each morning with the rising sun. I hoped that as you ended your day, that ancient epic had been a good story for you. I looked forward to your comments and requests. You did not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea have brought you peace, until we met again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.